ask you a question. Did you watch my last video? You didn't. What are you doing here? Go watch that first. This is a part 2. Anyway, let me ask you a question. Have you ever wanted to build Nilou incorrectly? Well, that's exactly what I asked myself recently, and let's say I found some interesting team comps and builds for Nilou that goes completely against what she's meant to do. Some of these teams actually turned out pretty good, and many of them didn't, but this was for fun mostly. So I wanted to take you on the journey with me, and go through the whole process. So, let's take it from the top. Unlike many of my other videos where I talk about a character's strengths and weaknesses, I think that won't really apply here as well, since we're going to be ignoring many of her core strengths to make these teams work. So instead, I decided to divide these teams into 3 categories. Off-field Nilou, on-field driver Nilou, and finally, main DPS Nilou. I'll go into more details on each category as we go. Something I need to make note of here though, is that most of these teams use similar builds. That of course is a Hydro DPS build. Some of them deviate from this, but mostly I was trying to take advantage of her Hydro infusion. This is much different to how you would normally build her when using her normal Superbloom team, where you would normally stack as much health as possible. But for now, let's get started with off-field and go from there. For most teams, her build is mostly irrelevant, as we will pretty much only be using her for her Hydro aura, which does no damage. Now she does do a few hits leading into the aura, which is why I left her with a Hydro DPS set, just to get that little bit of extra damage out of her. So, one of the first teams that came to mind was a Lisa Hyperbloom team. One of my first videos on Genshin covered this team, and I thought that perhaps Nilou's Hydro aura could be a reasonable replacement for Xinqiu. That was not the case. Now, that is not to say that it didn't work, but after a couple of comparisons, it was clear that Xinqiu was so much better at it that the team looked really bad by comparison. Kinda fun, not really worth it though. Now, that being said, the actual first team I thought about when approaching this topic was this Dia Vape team. So this team was something I'd heard a bit of rumbling about a while earlier, but since I only just got Nilou recently, I could only try it for myself now. And you know what? This team's pretty nice. A frequent complaint about Dia when she came out was that she couldn't use the overpowered Hydro characters to do crazy vaporize damage, like many of the other Pyro DPS out there. But with this setup, you can circumvent that. Worth noting here that I think for this team, Dia should probably use the Emblem of Severed Fate set from Inazuma if you don't have the new set available for her yet. This would be to get her burst up more frequently, which is more or less the bread and butter of this build. For my tests, I didn't do this, but my workaround for her energy was running a C6 Bennett that could give her a Pyro infusion to fill in the burst downtime, which did feel pretty good. I will probably come back to this team as my artifacts get better and better in a future video, but for now, this is pretty solid. After these teams, I started to think, doesn't Hydro have another reaction that it's incredibly well known for? Something that's kind of overpowered? Oh yeah, right, freeze teams. So I got to brewing up a very basic Ayaka freeze team, also known as a Morgana team, that could take advantage of Nilou's constant Hydro application. That being said, Nilou has some pretty stiff competition for the Hydro spot in a freeze team, but she actually performed pretty well here. Where she lacks Xinqiu's damage, she can get around his normal attack restrictions. Where she lacks Kokomi's healing, she brings mobility. At the end of the day, I think she makes for a pretty solid option in this team. But if you're like me and want to use Shenhe in this team, and still want a powerful Anemo unit to bring in the team together, you'll probably have to use Jean. There are other ways of setting this up, like using Diona as your healer, or trying to shy away from the Anemo support slot entirely, but I found Jean to be a pretty healthy compromise. That and I lost my 50-50 to her while rolling for Baizhu. so I might as well use this C2 gene I have, right? Next up on the list are teams where Nilou is an elemental reaction driver. These teams are focused not on her personal damage, though that is now a factor in these teams more so than before at least, but instead focusing on the reactions she can do with her easy-to-use Hydro Infusion. Again, these teams will be using a bog-standard Heart of Depth set, focusing on health and crit stats, plus my Jade Cutter, though this won't truly be relevant until we get into the more DPS-focused Nilou teams. First up, we have Taser Nilou. The team started off using the usual Electrocharge squad of Fischl and Beidou, and it seemed to work for a while, until I noticed a critical flaw. From what I can tell, similar to Raiden Shogun, Nilou's infused normal attacks do not activate Beidou's burst, meaning you end up losing out on a lot of damage. With this revelation in mind, I decided to remove Jean for Kazuha and rely on a different healer for the job, Cookie Shinobu. So right off the hop, I love Taser teams. I like Electrocharge in a lot of situations, and it deals with a lot of situations, especially when you're dealing with small to large groups. And Nilou makes a pretty solid driver for this style of team, while bringing a good chunk of her own personal damage. Now, that being said, I am super biased on this one. But for me, this team is a lot of fun. Maybe give it a go. As an aside though, Dori can be a possible replacement for Shinobu in this team, and Fischl and Kazuha can be replaced by almost any other character in the respective elements. This team went through quite a few iterations before I was really happy with it. First I started with a Hyperbloom team where Nilou could create the Bloom Cores with her Hydro Infusion, and Cookie's skill could fire them off as Hyperblooms. Sadly, as the previous Hyperbloom team, it felt kind of lackluster compared to the normal Lisa Shincho version. Better than the previous attempt, but it was still lacking something. So next I changed it up for a bit to a Burgeon team, having Toma fill the role of Cookie to do some sick Burgeons. Again, similar result. So finally, someone in my stream chat suggested trying an Overvape team, to which I said, why stop there? So it became this Burgeon Bloom Vape thing? Name aside, let's just call it Burgeon Bloom for now. Though I'm sure the Genshin community has a clever food theme named for it that I'm just not aware of at the moment. Anyway, this team follows the principle of putting all the elemental reactions we can into a single team, and honestly it works pretty well. This is the first team where Nilou's personal damage is a bit more relevant, as she does get the occasional vape in this setup. Pretty fun, and given that all these elemental reactions are all very good on their own, you can't really go wrong. Also for this team, both Toma and Cookie are best served using the Paradise Lost artifact set, focusing on as much elemental mastery as possible. Now onto the final team type. Main DPS Nilou. This is where the Heart of Depth set really comes into play, trying to get as much damage as we can out of Nilou's infusion as possible. So let's get right into it. This team is very straightforward, using Zhongling, a second Hydro character for the Resonance bonus, and an Anemo character to lower resistances with Virides and Venerer. We can do some pretty hardy damage with each one of Nilou's normal attacks. These vapes were actually pretty surprising. Now this is what I would call the Ayato we have at home. Now obviously compared to Superbloom, this isn't anywhere near as good. But for those who want to try something a bit different or are a little bit bored of Nilou's normal offerings, this is a pretty good and fun option. This was the first team that I even had in mind when putting this whole video together. But there was one other one. Now that I think about it, it's also becoming another staple of this channel. This team was a mistake. With a C6 Bennett and Nilou's Hydro Aura, Nilou can all of a sudden vape her own skill and do pyro damage that you would not expect to see on a Hydro support unit. Just throw your best Crimson Witch set on Nilou with a good DPS weapon and you're pretty much good to go at that point. This team is god-awful. but it was really fun to put together and see it almost work. Honestly, if I had a better Crimson Witch set for her, there might have been a bit more hope for this team. But like I've said before, I live for this stupid kind of stuff. A few other angles you could take with this team would be using a similar setup, but with an extra Dendro unit to make Nilou into her own Burgeon driver as well. The sky's the limit. So that's pretty much the end of what I came up with for now. But honestly, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for weird Nilou teams. For example, I only just got Candace, and I haven't even had a chance to build her yet. I can only imagine what kind of weird build paths that could open up just on her own. I had a lot of fun doing this, and I hope you had some fun too following along with this slightly unhinged team building session. Now, next week, while streaming here on YouTube, my next project is to continue these weird builds, but this time, taking the other half of the Superbloom combo I talked about last week, Kaveh. Granted, a lot of those should feel a lot more normal, especially by comparison. With that, if you like what I'm doing and you think I deserve it, please leave a like, subscribe, or leave a comment sharing what your favorite unhinged Nilou team is. If you have something crazier or weirder than I came up with, please tell me. I'd love to try it. Anyway, that's all for me. Cheers.